This lecture will focus on something called urbanization, a time in American history where people were moving to the city, and the city was changing to suit the new people that were moving in. After the Civil War was over, cities really started to expand and get much larger. The just the population that was moving to the cities was getting really big. People were moving from rural areas as well as other countries, and cities just started to get big. So New York City, for instance, in 1860 had a more than 800,000 inhabitants, but about 800,000 population, and over the course of 40 years it went to 3.5 million people. Over that same amount of time, Chicago also grew really rapidly from 109,000 residents to over 1.6 million people. The United States had many large cities too, not just a couple of really large cities, but they went from 130 large cities to about 1,700 large cities in that same time frame as New York and Chicago were growing into these monster cities. Um, People from like I said, people from rural areas, so from out in the country, as well as people from completely other countries started to move into the cities. There were a few reasons that they moved into the cities. The cities were really appealing because they could get better paying jobs. A lot of these people that were stuck out in the country and didn't have their own farms were just tenant farmers. They were people that were renting other people's land and not making very much money off of the farming of it. So they can move in and work in factories or get a skilled job or do something like that. And they would all of a sudden be making a lot more money and be able to elevate themselves in social class. Also, many of these new cities had electricity. Remember, we've got Edison out there bringing electricity to New York City, which quickly brought electricity to many cities, and you wouldn't have to deal with kerosene lighting and heating and stuff like that. You'd have electricity. Modern plumbing was another really big draw. You had toilets and sinks and all of these different things that you could use on that we see in society all the time that were just kind of new to the city, and you didn't have those same things out in the country. And then last but not least, really what was important is entertainment. There was so much more opportunity for entertainment in the city. You had music and sports and all kinds of different things that were happening in the cities that were not happening in rural America because there just weren't the people to perform those things. And even if there were people that were good at performing those things, they didn't have an audience to perform them for. So with all these people moving to the cities, the population started to grow. And when the population started to grow and you have the same amount of land in the city, the land becomes more valuable. It's worth more money because more people are competing to buy it. And so with this land becoming so valuable and so expensive, people started to think of different ways to develop the city. And they thought instead of growing outwards and making our buildings bigger, wider, we would build them up higher into the air. And so skyscrapers were invented and starting to be used at this time. Skyscrapers are tall steel frame buildings and built again up because the land in the city is so expensive and you want to be able to develop a large amount. And so this development was happening, these changes in cities were happening, and Hamilton Diston was one person who kind of made another smart move and created some of these cities. Hamilton Diston drained different parts of the Florida Everglades, and he drained the swamp area, and it became land, and he created about 4 million acres of new land. This caused a land boom in Florida. Many people started running in to try and get it, and a lot of different cities were formed in the St. Petersburg, Tampa Bay type area. Cities like Kissimmee and Gulfport and other cities in that area. Now, with these cities being made and these cities getting wider and bigger, people needed to be able to move around, and they needed mass transit. They needed that public transportation system. And so, in 1890, most of the transportation or this public transit was moved by about 70% was moved by horse car. And a horse car is literally just a train car that is pulled by horses. So that was how most of it was doing or going along. And then some cities beginning with San Francisco in 1873, installed these things called cable cars. And cable cars were these railroad cars again that were pulled by underground cables that pulled them along these different areas. So they'd be stuck on the same rail all the time. It's not like they could go anywhere, but they were able to just be pulled by these cables instead of getting horses or any animals or humans involved there. Okay, and then soon after that, electric trolley cars were invented, and some electric trolley lines came into being in a lot of different cities, starting in Virginia. And finally, congestion started to be an issue. So the streets were busy. There was too much going on in the streets, so we couldn't have these cars going all over in the streets. And so there were some innovations in some of the major cities in California. I'm sorry, not California. In Chicago, they elevated them and they had them off the road. Up above the road is where these cars were, up an above ground railroad. And then New York went underground and dug tunnels and made the very first subway system in America, and one of the largest ones still today. The cities were also separated by class, with the upper class, the middle class, so the upper class of the rich, the middle class, and the working class poor living in different parts of town. And in some cities today, you can still see these different parts of town that were created back at this time. The rich people had these nice large houses in these very fashionable neighborhoods at the center of the city to be close to their businesses. And they spent a ton of money. So oftentimes, as their houses start to get bigger, they would have servants and cooks and nannies and all that kind of stuff to do the work of the house for them. And then with even more money, they started to really spend a lot on parties, essentially. And so if you think about it, in one example, in a time where most New Yorkers lived on about $500 every single year, there was one really fancy rich person by the name of Cornelia Sherman Martin who spent $360,000 on a single dance. So 500 a year is what most people lived on. She spent 360,000 on one party, on one dance, which is kind of crazy to think about. And so, these rich people also started to not have as much to do. So they had at least one live-in servant. So they had more time to pursue, women had more time to pursue other things. And so they got into women's clubs, and women's clubs worked together towards a lot of different charities. And so it kind of grew the charity movement of this time as well from these women's clubs. As this industry started to grow, we started to see a larger middle class coming in, people like doctors and lawyers and engineers, managers, social workers, architects, teachers, okay, all of these middle class people who were professionals but didn't have like rich people money, weren't owning these huge businesses. They decided they wanted a bigger house. They wanted to escape the pollution and the crime and all that kind of stuff of the inner city, and so they moved away from the central city. And they could also afford further away from the central city. They could afford bigger houses with more land, which was nice as well. And so these were known as streetcar suburbs because the streetcars could still bring them into their jobs in the cities, but they could live further away in a much more comfortable way. The third group, which was the largest group, was the working class poor. Most people couldn't afford their own homes at all, and so they had to rent, and they had to rent in these large tenements. Tenements are multifamily apartment buildings, really often cramped and in bad conditions. And if you wanted to be able to afford an entire tenement, an entire apartment in these tenements, you would often have to use your money as well as make some more money by allowing somebody else to come in and live there. So you would rent some of your space, your own little tiny apartment. You would rent some of it out to a boarder, to a person who would come in, who was trying to work in the area, and could pay a small amount of money to stay with you. And like I said, this was most of them. About 3 out of every 4 New York City resident was in one of these tenements. Take a moment to write an answer to checkpoint number 1. Now, even within the poor working class, there were differences, and the differences kind of went along racial lines as well as gender lines. anybody who was an African American, an immigrant, or a woman was receiving lower wages at this time. That's how it was. They just weren't making as much money. And during this time, about 64% of all of the families, so that's about 2 out of every 3 families, were relying on more than one wage. So it wasn't just dad would go out and work and whatever, it was more than one person within the household had to work. And so the women and the children were often working, and this was a problem to a lot of reformers. A lot of people were concerned about this because they said, well, first off, we're putting these kids in these dangerous conditions in factories and stuff like that, but also they're not in school, so how are they going to get educated and make their lives and their futures better? Women were mostly working outside of the house at this time. White women were often more educated at this point. And so they were out there working in more professional jobs and making more money as teachers or clerks or secretaries often. Whereas African Americans and immigrants were doing very different things. They were essentially household servants, and you would get paid very little, and you would work long hours, and you'd be isolated socially from other people that were like you. And so it was really kind of a difficult job. And in the North, it was mostly immigrants that would take these jobs because of their difficulty. And then in the South, it was mostly African American women who would take on these roles. So at this point, there were some pretty large problems in the city as well, and we'll kind of outline 4 of them here. First off is crime. Crime, of course, when you get an urban population, you get a bunch of people together. It's very easy for thieves and swindlers and pickpockets and all these kinds of people who are preying on people and trying to get their money. It's much easier for them to stay in business, keep making money off of this because there's more people to take advantage of. Also, at this time, even more major crimes started to occur. Murder rates started to increase. They were about 25 people murdered per million in 1880 to by the time 1900 came around, there were about 100 people per million that were murdered in America. So the growth of these cities really started to increase the murder rate as well. Pollution was another problem. First off, there was improper sewage disposal. So, and this improper sewage disposal would contaminate the drinking water and give people cholera and things like that. And it wasn't really like there was proper toilets, proper sewage systems and things like that at this point. It's just that horses were being used really widely, and their manure, their poop would be left out there, and it would wash into the water systems, and it would be a problem, as well as just smoke from the chimneys and soot and ash as people were heating their houses with coal fires and wood fires, and so the air was quite polluted as well. Fire was also a big problem because, again, you're basically heating up your wooden house with coal fires and wood fires, actual live fires, as opposed to just heated air, and that often caused fires, which in a city where everything was made out of wood and there wasn't much fire safety and everybody was really close together, it could really easily jump from one building to another and burn down whole blocks or whole miles of a city. So fire was a very big concern at this time, as well as political corruption. We'll talk about a little bit more on the next slide and give you some more information about that. Political corruption at this point was a really, really big problem in the cities. A lot of it had to do with these political machines that were being built. And so a political machine is just an informal group, so it's not like a party or anything, but it's an informal political group, usually affiliated with a political party, that formed to try and gain power in an area and then to try and keep that power as much as possible. And a party boss was the person who was in charge of this political machine. And what this political machine did for you is it provided things that people needed. These people in the cities needed jobs, houses, food, heat, police protection. They needed all these things. And the political machines and the party bosses were able to get these things for them, and all they needed in exchange was their votes to keep them in power and keep them in office. And so maybe that's not such a bad thing that they were able to do this, but what became a big problem is these party bosses started to become rich using something called graft. Graft is just gaining money or power illegally. And so what they would often do is there would be contracts to, let's say, build a new library for the government, right? And everyone should have to put in a bid and say how much it will cost, and it should be compete, or you should be able to compete fairly with all the other companies. But what would happen is some of these companies would go in and they would bribe the bosses, and of course they would get to build the library for the government no matter how high their price was. So they could, if you bribe the bosses, you could charge a whole lot more money and you could make up for that money that you had to spend. Also, a lot of these people, a lot of the city needs services. They need people to run railroads, or to run the electricity, or run these different things, and these party bosses would often give those jobs to their friends because they could make a lot of money off of them. One of the most famous political machines was known as Tammany Hall. It was a New York City Democratic machine, probably the most infamous. Their leader, their famous leader, was Boss Tweed, and Boss Tweed, William Tweed was his actual name. He was the leader in the 1860s and 70s, and he had so much corruption that in 1874 he was actually put in prison for it. And so this was a big problem, but these political machines, they ran everything. They ran the police and everything, so they really had no fears of ever being arrested or ever getting in trouble for it. And a lot of people said that this is terrible and these corrupt bosses are making money for themselves, but other people say that really the political machines that they had built really got a lot of those services out and helped a lot of the new city dwellers to become successful and part of the city. Take a moment to write out 3 questions you have from the notes so far. If you don't have any questions, then please create 3 test questions that you might see on a quiz or a test from this material.